Welcome to Bets on the Future, where we highlight the various career paths in the electrifying metals world. From the vehicle you ride in to the bridge holding it up, metals are everywhere. Why not in your career too? I'm Jennifer Betts, a metals industry veteran with almost 20 years experience, here to highlight these incredible career paths as told by the women who are living them. Welcome to Bets on the Future. This week we have Adina Renee Adler. She is the Executive Director for the Global Steel Climate Council. Adina was appointed Executive Director of the Global Steel Climate Council in December 2023. She was previously Deputy Executive Director at Silverado Policy Accelerator, a think tank leading their work on trade and the circular economy, critical minerals supply chains, and other key trade and environmental policy issues, while also executing Silverado's growth strategy. Adina was also Vice President of Advocacy for the Recycling Industries Association, the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries, ISRI, now the Recycling Materials Association, REMA. Director of Global Government Affairs for Alcoa and Arconic, the International Government Relations Advisor for Shell Oil Company. Adina's government service included working for the Office of the United States Trade Representative, USTR, and the U.S. Department of Commerce. She has a BA in International Affairs for the George Washington University and MA in International Economics and International Law from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. Please welcome to the Bets on the Future podcast, Adina Renee Adler. Well, I just want to say a huge thank you to our guest today, because if you're listening, you can't see this, but for somebody that follows you on LinkedIn, I have to say thank you, because I'm looking at you in a hotel room, and I know you've been in a few of those recently, a few airplanes recently. I want to give a warm welcome to Adina Renee Adler, the Executive Director of the Global Steel Climate Council, to the Bets on the Future podcast. Thank you so much for jumping on. I know we are squeezing into a very busy schedule as of late. So again, thank you so much for hopping on to this podcast.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me, Jennifer. I've been looking forward to this, that's for sure. And finding the time to do it has been hard, but at the same time, I was determined to get on the schedule no matter what. So this is great.
We were slightly optimistic that maybe we could have met in Vegas last week at
That's
your,
right.
I'll call it your alma mater. Actually, where we first met, I want to say many moons ago.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, going back, man, how many years ago now has it been?
Since we met, I mean, 7, 8, 6,
yeah,
5. I'm not sure.
yeah,
Time
yes.
has gotten away from me. That's for sure.
Yes. But the reference, and depending on when this podcast comes out, it is the ISRI 2024 conference, which has been now rebranded the REMA conference. It's the Recycled Materials Industry Conference. And unfortunately, you actually were coming back from Europe, going to Europe.
I was in Europe. I actually got invited to 5 events in 1 week, which is not a commentary, but a commentary on, for whatever reason, everything was being crammed in the same week. And I think everybody was thinking about, well, Earth Day is coming up, so we got to get messaging out, I guess. And so I had to make the tough decision that 3 of them were in Europe. I rejiggered the schedule to be there in person, but then I still had the opportunity to participate at ISRI on my panel by Zoom. So God bless technology for allowing me to do as much of it as I possibly could.
That's amazing. I'm gonna have to go back and check out that panel, because that's pretty impressive. Probably also not great for the time zone change for you, though.
It was a little late, but it was worth staying up. We had a conversation about the EV supply chain, and it was actually a really dynamic conversation where we talked with people who think about, the dismantling and the recycling of electric vehicles. And I was thinking about the material elements, especially from a steel point of view, And just what does that all kind of look like going into the future? So it was a great discussion. So yes, please go back and take a look at it.
It really is quite interesting that, from your perspective and your background, you really are perfectly set up to be in the position that you are today because of your background. And I want to get a little bit into it because I don't imagine most people, from their childhood think metals. I want to like
No. Well,
so I kind of want to get into that, where was that turning point? Like, how did you get into this industry? Tell me a little bit more
yeah,
about it.
actually, it's not that I did this intentionally, but I did grow up around metals.
Okay.
My father was a fastener distributor. And so he was a importer of screws, nuts, bolts, everything that goes right into making everything on the planet. And then he would be a distributor, to the manufacturers, mainly here in the United States. And so it's funny when I visit a steel mill now, and I had this when I worked for Alcoa too, when I would visit aluminum mills, there's this smell of metal covered in oil that is like literally transports me back. But that's actually has that childhood experience has nothing to do with how I got here, other than having the opportunity, to go to the college that I want to and study international affairs at GW, at George Washington University in DC, and a master's in international law and international economics, and then just translating that into a career where I could, make a difference in the world in some way. So worked for the Commerce Department, worked for the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, being an advocate for U.S. businesses in overseas markets. I went to go work for Shell Oil Company, which was super interesting in learning about energy economics. And it's a commodity space. And then, of course, when I think back, well, they're a major consumer of steel products, so that was helpful. And then I jumped to aluminum, and Alcoa. Aluminum and steel have so many similarities. In terms of international markets and international and the economics of the businesses, just obviously in different ways, but very similar. And then of course I got to go work for ISRI for a while, which was awesome, and promoting the fact that recyclable commodities are tradable commodities. So working, sticking with my international trade expertise and passion, but still on behalf of the manufacturing supply chain. And then I went to go do a little thought leadership for a while on circular economy and critical minerals and supply chain resilience, and then found myself here in metals. But so it's been this long and winding road that, no, when I was a kid, I thought I was going to be a diplomat. So I always knew there was going to be some like international angle, but I thought I was going to get into the State Department and work in embassies overseas. And I learned very, very early on that wasn't the only path towards some international connection in my career. And I have no regrets that I didn't go in that way, because I found so many of these other opportunities. And, just the last comment, I'll often talk to recent grad students, who will come to me and say, how do I get your job? And I'm like, well, first you're going to have to start at the bottom, like we all do. But also, like, some people really feel like they need to have a plan. I'm going to do this for 5 years. I'm going to do that for 5 years. And that is not at all how I got here. I still don't have a plan, but I just grab onto opportunities. I meet interesting people. I see the wide world of how we live and what the economics look like and what the environment needs from us, and just see where I can fit in and make a difference.
Well, the Global Steel Climate Council didn't even exist when you were in college, right? Like, so how could
Well,
you have
no,
even
it didn't
made a
exist while
plan,
I was at ISRI.
right?
Yeah, I know. So the Global Steel Climate Council, or GSCC, because we love our acronyms in Washington, was founded in late 2022. by a group of steel companies that have heard the call for emissions reduction in the steel industry. And they're taking the bull by the horns and saying, all right, we're going to do this, and we're going to be ambitious, and we're going to hold ourselves accountable, and we're going to show the world that we're going to make actual and real emissions reduction. This is going to be our climate strategy. So they formed in 2022 when I was still doing some other work. But I got a phone call last summer asking if I would be interested in maybe taking up the helm as their first executive director. And I, from the get-go, was so interested in it because I can still be involved in manufacturing and in metals in particular, but I can still embrace my tree hugging self and do right by the environment, and build some skill sets and knowledge and interests and networks along the way.
Well, and I imagine it's also the diplomat because steel is everywhere, right? And it is a global commodity. And obviously you're traveling the world as well. So it seems, I mean, that's kind of what I alluded to at the beginning. Like it really does feel like this is where you should be. Like your career has led you perfectly to this position again that didn't exist a few years ago.
Yeah, no, it really has been an amazing experience. And I haven't even been in it for 5 months, which is also, although it feels a lot longer, which is pretty amazing. I do kind of feel like I found a spot for myself in the universe, and am doing my best to be ambitious even in how I grow the organization and how we set, how I set goals for myself. I mean, I even had the board say to me that maybe my goals were too ambitious. And my response was, well, why not? I may not meet them, but I'm not afraid to try. And so it is this great confluence of personal interests, career interests, and passions, combined with some skill sets that I've picked up along the way. And because it is an international commodity, there are a lot of issues and events that happen around the world. You wouldn't think geopolitically that the steel industry can or should care about, but they do, because of the impact. And I don't think that I would have been in a good place, to be able to process all of that and support the industry in a way that I can without all the lived experience that I've had within cultures, within different economies, within different political systems, and being able to process that information and advise the businesses on understanding where they need to go from here.
I really liked your tree hugger comment on, earlier because there is this sentiment that's out there and that's a little bit, I'll say it, it's negative towards steel and in some regards, just from an outsider's perspective. And it's frustrating to me because those individuals shy away from our industry instead of someone like yourself that says, no, I'm going towards it. I can use my knowledge, my expertise, and make it better, right? Like you look at it as an opportunity of, okay, they understand that there is an issue here, that they are wanting to make it better. They're looking at decarbonization. How do we introduce new technology? How do we execute that new technology? And they go for it instead of, oh, we're just going to complain about it from the outside and not do anything about it.
Yeah, and that's what's so amazing about the companies that I work with. And it's not like a new phenomenon. They're not just deciding, oh, so if you look on our website, our mission statement actually incorporates the Paris Climate Agreement, because the idea is to drive emissions reduction towards a 1.5-degree scenario by 2050, as outlined in the Paris Climate Agreement, and we utilize the IEA carbon budget to get there. But that was signed in 2015. So we're not even 10 years since then. But the companies have been doing it for like 50 years. And it's not well understood. 70% of steel in the United States is made through a circular process, which is already a way lower carbon footprint than the traditional steel making, which is the other 30%. And even then, the traditional steel making in the US is at least a lower carbon footprint than we see in, say, China, So it is this narrative that doesn't understand, yes, globally, I think the steel industry accounts for 7 to 8% of global emissions, but we're taking into consideration the dirty sources within the industry, and which overrides somehow in the mindset all of the real green metal that's coming out in the US and in Europe and in South America as well, in particular. And that it is a good industry. And it's not just about utilizing recycled metal. It's about the investments that they're making in renewable energy, to be able to power the furnaces, not from fossil fuel based energy, but from alternative sources. It's the innovations that are coming on board soon for more advanced technologies to make steel in what will be a low carbon or near zero carbon future. So it actually really is super exciting, and they're mindful that their employees who live in the communities just want to live in a place where the air is cleaner, and so it's a way to do right by their own people. So it's pretty exciting what's out there. We just got to find it, and I think there is a recognition kind of generally that they all need to tell a better story about that anyway, and this is one way to do that.
Absolutely. It's something that I run into, dare I say, on TikTok, with that narrative that and it's getting better, I will have to say, because there are a handful of steel companies that are getting out there a little bit more on some of the social media sites, sharing what they've been working on, being a little bit more open about some of those investments that they're making that isn't what has been, I would say, traditional in the past, of what people have expected from a steel company. And it really does put in perspective when you take a look at the United States versus, some of the rest of the world. And obviously I'm biased. I am from the United States, but I really do think what we're working on here in the United States, from our raw materials, from our green energy options to the labor force, we really are set up very nicely to be at the forefront of the metals manufacturing space for a variety of reasons. And again, what you're working on at the GSCC is really incredible to see, not just from obviously bringing, the manufacturing aspect to folks' attentions, but to your point, like you're working on, reaching the Paris climate agreement, right? Like you're working on additional aspects that, again, traditionally people think of steel not necessarily as the cleanest thing, and there are ways to make it, net neutral, cleaner. There are other ways to produce it.
Yeah, and not only that they are contributing to other industries who are making their own emissions reduction and sustainability commitments, because steel is everywhere. And whether it's in infrastructure build outs, it's the next generation of buildings and bridges, where there's a conscious decision to utilize lower carbon input materials, to vehicles who are making, there are several brands that are making commitments to make a net zero, whatever that means, but a net zero automobile, and to be doing it soon. Or the renewable energy infrastructure itself, the wind towers and the frames that hold solar panels are all steel, so that's the amazing power, and the fact that low carbon steel is already available on the market, it's growing, and then it contributes to this holistic approach to a more sustainable future.
It really has been interesting to see what feels like the past 5 to 10 years, this shift, but shift maybe is not the right word, but almost this exponential increase of investments, of developments, technology implementation in the steel industry. I've been in the industry a couple decades, and there was talks about some of these things 20 years ago, but it really doesn't feel like until 10 years ago maybe that some of these things really started to take off. Is that probably, I mean, that's just perception for me.
Yeah, no, I think that's about right. And I have not been in the industry that long. So, those who have been in a lot longer can forgive me, if I don't recall the exact date of, when it really took off. But the important thing is that it is, right?
Mhm.
But I think what's important to note, because you and I are both American, although we may have listeners in outside of the United States, but a lot of this grew because of the market opportunity, not because there was pressure from an environmental community or a government or others saying, wait a minute, you guys are terrible, you need to improve. They already knew that the technologies were in existence. It was creating efficiency gains. And more steel consumers were interested in the product. And oh, by the way, it was good for the environment. It was like, I don't want to say that it was like an afterthought. It was just, what I see in a lot of these conferences that I'm attending, especially in Europe, and I realize it's a little bit of a different situation, but there's so many calls on governments to do this and governments to do that, and the handouts that are needed and more regulation. And I just sort of think about the last 40 to 50 years of the exponential growth of the electric arc furnace in particular, steel producing technology, and almost all of that came on its own
Mhm.
without pressures and without mandates, regulation, and even to some extent, not even with subsidies, although, tax issues, tax breaks are other things. But, if we just allow the market to make those decisions, and the market is largely driven by consumers, we will see success in this continue. And of course, it needs to be done in a very green and sustainable way, and that's happening in the West. How do we stimulate that in the East? Or in the global South, however you want to call it. I think that's really, really important. It's not happening. But yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I think it really did take off in a consciousness way, but it was already happening.
And just for clarification, because this podcast does scan over, the full supply chain, I suspect a lot of the listeners at this point, hopefully, because they've probably heard me say an EAF, electric arc furnace, a few times at this point. But if they're unfamiliar with an electric arc furnace, it is one of the two ways to make steel. It's essentially taking existing steel and remelting it with, shocker, electricity, hence the electric in that name. And it's one of the, dare I say, more sustainable ways to make steel at this point, just because it's usually a lower carbon footprint because it's already existing steel. You're just heating it up to a high temperature, remelting it, and pushing it out through a continuous casting process.
And that is all 100% true. And yet, the companies that run electric arc furnaces also recognize that there's even more that they can do to lower their carbon footprint even more, right? And so the GSCC, what we did is we created a standard that incorporates both a corporate-wide emissions reduction target setting framework with product certification, where you can market a product with a certain carbon footprint. And all of this, of course, has to go through a whole auditing and verification process as based on this, what we call the Steel Climate Standard. But what I don't do is tell them how to do it. all we can do is say, here's how you set your targets. And then we require that they be checked, every 3 to 5 years to make sure that they continue on their pathway down. So I don't tell them how to do it, but what I'm hearing from the marketplace are so many different ways that they can continuously reduce their carbon footprint, even when they're already using 100% scrap. And this is a great alternative to other programs and approaches that are affording, certified low carbon steel, whatever that means, almost entirely based on how much scrap utilization, while also complaining that there isn't enough in the world. And I don't understand how you have a program that's based on a deficiency already built in. But all of this is to say is that, yes, the electric arc furnace, a little bit more sustainable, but there's even more that they can do. And we have the pathways for the integrateds to also join us on this journey. It requires hard choices. I don't at all doubt that. But it doesn't mean that we're asking, yes, if you sign up today to become a member of the GSCC, we're not asking you to reduce your carbon footprint in 5 years. We're actually, it actually is written into the standard that there is a good, you just need to be on our glide path by 2040. So it gives companies plenty of time to figure out, what does that business model look like? What are the technologies? How do we prepare for the transition, which may include having to address other community, labor, environmental, waste management, all kinds of different power issues to be able to get on that glide path. But but if the ambition is there and the interest is there, we're here to be a guide.
Which I think that's a really great way to look at it, because the integrated facilities that do exist in the United States, for instance, they weren't built yesterday. None of them were built in the past decade, for instance. And so a lot of them are coming up at that time for reinvestment, is what I'll call it. And so it does come at a good time to take a look at, okay, you're going to need to reinvest in those structures anyway, into those processes. This is probably a good time to take a look at, okay, for the next 10, 20, 30 years, how do I want to operate, right? What's the best way to move forward in essentially a competitive landscape? If the growing EAF is going to continue to produce this type of product, how do I compete with that? What are the options? And just it's an opportunity for them to reassess before they start making capital improvements.
Yeah, and it just may depend on, what is the market requiring or requesting or demanding? So what does the customer base need? And so then thinking about, what does that business model look like of the future to be able to meet that customer demand, for sure.
Exactly. When you were talking about raw materials, when it comes to the recycled steel, I saw one of the EAF companies post on Instagram recently that they recycle 20 million tons of steel a year. And when people start talking about, oh, we may not have enough scrap or recycled materials, apologies, Rima, if you're listening, we export in the United States roughly around 17 million tons of ferrous a year. And so that's roughly about the same amount as essentially the largest steel manufacturer in North America. So we essentially would have to see that amount of capacity coming online that would absorb that amount of, I almost said it. It's going to take some time. Recycled material.
That's right.
Recycled material. So, I mean, it's definitely possible for that to come online, but at the same time, our population is growing, our consumption is going to be growing, and also we're going to be generating more of that recycled steel down the line. So I don't necessarily buy into personally right now that we're going to run out of that material down the road, but
Well, we're not going to in the US, but I think there are real challenges, though, in other parts of the world. And steel is being made in a lot of different countries, including throughout, the developing world. where the infrastructure for collection and recycling is barely existent in a lot of different places. Or in the case of China, it exists, but their steel making apparatus is so ginormous. You can there's no way to supply enough raw material, recycled or non-recycled as possible to feed those furnaces. But I do think it is I do see a real challenge though when you look at it globally. So we are in a lucky position for purposes of our domestic consumption and needs. And if we are able to collect and process more than we need here, to what extent we fulfill that demand in other parts of the world. And we do, obviously, through trade, which is really critically important. But there are a lot of estimates of tremendous greenfield growth in the developing world, which is why there's so much steel making happening. That it's that much production that's going to be required, and that's, but the irony of the whole thing is that steel is made to last forever. So although I always say to people, it's not so much the steel itself, it's the product that it's in. And when you think about automobiles, for example, you're going to have user error. It's going to shorten the life of the steel. So, recycled becomes available. But buildings are intended to last 50 years, and bridges are, Baltimore notwithstanding, but bridges are intended to last just about as long as they possibly can. So then, of course, you don't have that ready supply of recycled metal in the future if steel is actually doing its original intent and job of lasting a very long time. So I do think it is actually a real problem in a number of regions around the world, but we are lucky that we find ourselves in a comfortable position here in the US.
Absolutely. And to put in perspective for those who may not be aware of our comfortable position is how I'll put it for the United States. The way that we make it up here is 70% roughly of our steel making is made from EAFs, the electric arc furnaces. The other 30% is from traditional steel making, the integrated from mined materials. And then Europe is essentially switched, roughly 70% is from the integrated method and 30% is from the EAFs. And it sounds like they're going to be pushing for more EAFs over there, hence the greater desire for the recycled steel increase over there. And then, to switch it over to China, for instance, which is 10 times the size of the United States steel market, just for size reference. Even though we're number 4 and they're number 1, just huge jump. They are 10% EAFs, 90% integrated. So if they just even hop up a little bit of their EAFs, it would be a giant jump in the amount of demand for those recycled materials. So
yeah, and it was always the intent in China until they realized that they just didn't have enough recycled material supply. And so I think the plans for building out EAF has slowed down a little bit until they can kind of, figure that out. I do want to give integrated, especially in the US, and to some extent in Europe too, I want to give them some credit that they are trying to build into at least interim solutions, ways to incorporate the use of more recycled metal to, as opposed to iron ore. So as replace a little bit. They can only go up to, I think, 20% 20 or 25% utilization, but that's better than where some companies I think are at less than 5. So definitely credit where credit is due, but then that just contributes to that increased demand.
Yes. And just as a, former shout out, I was a raw materials manager at AK Steel, now Cleveland Cliffs. So I did purchase recycled steel for the integrated facility. So yes, I was putting recycled steel into those furnaces over there. So we were trying to utilize as much as we could, but obviously there is like you said, you could only put so much in there. So
That's right.
it maxes out. I know that we're probably bumping up against your schedule, but is there any like last minute thoughts? Did we miss any additional topics that I know we went a little bit over
Yeah.
on?
No, it's okay. I think just coming back on brand, one of the most amazing things about, so in my travels, I've been trying to also meet some of our steel companies, right? And I've talked to representatives of all of them, and there's just so many women that I do connect with. Although a lot of them, at least of the ones that I've connected with so far, are in the office, the headquarters, the C-suites, right? So in their sustainability offices, there's lots of women in sustainability, which is amazing. And women in advocacy and in the legal department, and especially in communications. But I've had a chance now to visit three plants, and at all three of them, and not that I've asked or requested for it, but there are women on the floor. And they are super passionate about the work that they do. They love their jobs. In fact, there was one in particular who's in leadership. I think she was a section manager of some sort. And you could see, the guys who work for her being deferential. They really truly believe in what they do. And these are companies that are giving them the opportunity, and without the old biases of whether or not women can handle, that hard work. That's the part that's been super fun, is meeting them and getting to know just what makes them want to come to work every morning. So that's been pretty cool.
That's fantastic to hear, because I've talked to some women that, the moment that they see the first time a charge bucket drops metal into an EAF, they're like, I'm done. Like I'm hooked, sold. Like they're like,
It's pretty
sign me up.
freaking cool. It gets me every time. I admit I couldn't work in a job like that, but I only say that because I'm not trained. Like I'm not a scientist. To understand the metallurgy is so beyond me. I'm a policy person and an advocate. But it is, you do see that, and it's pretty awesome.
It is really cool. If anybody ever has a chance to tour steel mill, rolling mill, like do it. Don't say no. It's really kind of like a once in a lifetime opportunity to, especially if it's running. It's incredible. Um, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. If anybody wants to get a hold of you, the best way, LinkedIn, visit the website.
Yeah, all of the above. And no, Jennifer, thank you so much for inviting me and for having this conversation. And thanks to you for all the passion that you put into this industry, by your writings, by your TikTok feed, as well, of course, as this podcast. Really, it's because of you that these opportunities are coming to light. So thank you, Jennifer, for all the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Adina Adler, Executive Director of the Global Seal Climate Council. Thank you so much.